Good afternoon. My name is Kenneth Tan. I am the Assistant Dean of Academic Affairs at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. It is my great pleasure today to welcome to the school Professor Sir Adam Roberts. Professor Roberts is a Senior Research Fellow, Department of Politics and International Relations at Oxford University. He is the Emeritus Fellow at Balliol College, Oxford. He was Montague Burton Professor of International Relations at Oxford University from 1986 to 2007. He is now President-elect of the British Academy and will take up his duties in July 2009. His public lecture today is titled Counterinsurgency, Doctrine, and Asian Realities. Please join me in welcoming Professor Roberts.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was a very generous and warm invitation, considering it came from somebody from Cambridge University. I want to introduce a discussion and invite your comments and criticisms, partly because what I have to say is a work in progress, just as the doctrine that I'm describing is a work in progress, not something fixed. And so I very much hope that you will, as I'm speaking, be thinking up questions, objections, fundamental disagreements. If any of you have difficulty hearing me, is this machine working all right? But raise your hand if you're having a problem hearing, please do, because I know how infuriating it can be when it's difficult to hear. What I want to do is not so much to address centrally the extremely difficult situation in Pakistan and Afghanistan, and particularly most of my focus, for a reason I'll mention in a moment, more of it will be on Afghanistan, but I don't want to address the totality of these situations, but rather to speak about the role of military doctrine in relation to them, and whether the military doctrine that has been used in Afghanistan and Pakistan is appropriate to the particular situation that is faced there. Now, what I have to say began with a challenge, and I'm one of those awful people who can't resist a challenge. I was asked by the US Naval War College at Newport, Rhode Island, when they were having a big conference last summer on Afghanistan. I was asked to give a keynote address there saying what I actually thought about the war in Afghanistan. And I agreed precisely because I thought it was a difficult challenge, and it would be particularly difficult for me as somebody who is by nature a skeptic to address people who were in many ways deeply involved in the Afghan operations. And at the conference there were many Army and Air Force officers as well as naval officers. And in preparing for that lecture, and I found that I had plenty grounds for skepticism. I must make it quite clear to you from the beginning that I've not been to Afghanistan, and I've only briefly been to Pakistan. And I could defend that position on the grounds that James Mill wrote a wonderful history of British India without ever going to India. And it's not a very strong defense, however. But it's as you will see, it's my central argument that in order to understand a country, one has to understand its history and its culture, and there are various ways of doing that, including by study, and that's what I tried to do. I should also say, in pathetic mitigation of my offence of not having been to Afghanistan, But I have two grown-up children, both of whom have worked in Afghanistan, have been quite deeply involved in different activities, one in election organising, monitoring and support generally, observation, and the other, my son, in setting up women's health clinics, both of which involve one quite deeply in the processes that are going on in Afghanistan. Now, in working on my paper, I was quite struck at how fateful the connections between events in Afghanistan and international security more generally have been over the past generation. Just think about it. Think of all the connections. Firstly, the defeat of the Soviet Union in the war in Afghanistan in the 1980s and their enforced retreat contributed substantially, in my view, to the end of the Cold War and to the end of the Soviet Union itself. So that's two colossal effects already from the war in Afghanistan. And then think of all the other effects. That it was largely because of the anti-Soviet jihadist struggle in Afghanistan that a global jihadist movement gained momentum. And many people who had been trained in Afghanistan, who had fought the good fight against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, then went off and fought elsewhere, including some turning up even in Europe, in Bosnia. So that's a major effect of the war in Afghanistan. But think of others. Think of the fateful way in which the war in Afghanistan is twinned with events in Pakistan, and how the events in Afghanistan and the Taliban and other struggles on both sides of the Durand Line, these have, among other things, contributed to the tensions between Pakistan and India, as well as raising questions about the stability of the Pakistan state. So there's a momentous effect of events in Afghanistan. And then add to that the extraordinary fact that NATO has got involved in Afghanistan, committed to a cause in that country through the activities of ISAF, when throughout its Cold War existence, NATO studiously avoided getting involved in conflicts labelled colonial. As NATO was not involved in the French war in Indochina or in the Portuguese wars in Africa, member states might go off and have their wars and these colonial matters, but it was not a concern of NATO as such. And now we have this huge NATO involvement. And, of course, it is through events in Afghanistan and 9/11 that we have had, and indeed continue to have, if in changing form, the global campaign against terrorism, the so-called global war on terror. That's a fantastic, momentous set of effects from events in a single country. If you were a fiction writer, you would have a job finding a country of 30 million that could have quite such major effects on the whole of the rest of the world as Afghanistan has had and continues to have and may have more in the future. So it's a big issue, and to address the issue, a primary doctrine, not the only doctrine, but a primary doctrine of the Western powers engaged in Afghanistan, and also to some extent in their pressures on the government of Pakistan to do something about the federally administered tribal areas, the FATA, and other areas where the writ of the Pakistan government does not run, at least not very strongly. In thinking about both of these, the emphasis has increasingly been on counterinsurgency doctrine. And that's a body of thought. If you have to look at it to list its key elements, what unites all notions of counterinsurgency, it seems to me that they consist of, first, an emphasis on the whole area of government policy being directed to undermining the insurgency, including, for example, by political changes. It necessarily involves restructuring armed forces from structures suitable to fighting major land battles against other similar armed forces to the very different circumstances of trying to either protect citizens from guerrilla activity or to hunt down guerrillas or terrorists or whatever they happen to be called. That requires a very different structure of armed forces. It often involves a doctrine of hearts and minds, which I regard as a somewhat simplistic term, but one that emphasizes the need for armed forces not just to, as it were, issue kinetic power through their weapons, but to actually win over the population. Now, those are the key elements of counterinsurgency doctrine, and it's a particularly important set of ideas, not because it's always right or wonderful, but because the instincts of armed forces faced with a maddening guerrilla insurgency, and the instincts of governments too, are often simply to try and stamp out the insurgency by whatever means can be done and kill as many insurgents as can be killed. That's often the instinct that arises when a society faces a guerrilla insurgency. And that instinct is almost always wrong, in the sense that there's a need for a more subtle approach that understands the reasons why the insurgency has come into being, responds to that, and understands the reasons why people might not have been supporting the government, and responds to that. So it has value as a doctrine, although it also has a negative history. There are not a few seedy dictators in various parts of the world, including Latin America, who have used counterinsurgency doctrine as a way of, or as a partial justification of putting concrete round the ankles of communists or people deemed to be subversive in some way and dumping them at sea. And indeed, one of the interesting features, of many interesting features of Barack Obama's autobiography is his reference to the war against communists in Indonesia and how seedy that looked. He saw, as it were, what you might call the underbelly of the American empire from his humble abode in Indonesia, and he didn't particularly like what he saw. And it's interesting that there is an American president who's aware of how American actions can be perceived by others coming from a different perspective. Now, in Asia, there's been a particular significance in the emergence of counterinsurgency doctrines, which is that many of the conflicts that have given rise to these doctrines, or in which they have been implemented, have in fact been in Asia. And it's been there that there have been some of the triumphs of the doctrine as well as some of the disasters. For example, in the Philippines from 1946 onwards, there was the Huk communist rebellion that was eventually defeated thanks to a radical change in policy instituted by the president of the Philippines, Ramon Magsaysay, who among other things, and this is not irrelevant to the current problems of Afghanistan, he cut corruption. He had an assault on corruption in the government, as well as completely restructuring the Filipino armed forces and changing the aims of the armed forces from ones that were merely assaulting the adversaries to also protecting the inhabitants, although he was very tough with the communist adversaries he faced and continued to be. But that was a campaign that ended with a degree of success, as, of course, too, did the campaign in Malaya, where from 1948, from 20th of June 1948 onwards, faced with an insurgency nominally of all the races of Malaya, but actually mainly of Chinese minority in Malaya, and mainly led by the Malayan Communist Party, that was eventually undermined and defeated by a very clear mixture of political change, including an absolutely clear commitment to the independence of Malaya. The British were not fighting purely to preserve British colonialism. There had to be that important promise to get out. Again, maybe relevant to some of the contemporary crises. And there was also an emphasis on the rule of law, not always perfectly observed in practice, but the idea that what was being fought for included the rights of citizens and lawful treatment of prisoners and others was an important part of the campaign. And the Malayan campaign gave rise to one of the most interesting books in the counterinsurgency school, Sir Robert Thompson's book, Defeating Communist Insurgency. And it's very, very interesting. It contains many salutary lessons in respect to the war on terror about the central importance of observing legal rules, including, I would add, it wasn't specific in Robert Thompson's formulation, but including international legal rules, which have, of course, developed a lot since his term. And then the third set of Asian realities which contributed greatly to counterinsurgency thinking were the French wars in Indochina and then the American war in Vietnam. And it's very striking, reading accounts of the French war in Indochina, how initially the French thought in traditional French military ways. In the early years of the Viet Minh insurrection, which was mainly in northern Vietnam, in Tonkin, the French built defensive lines. And then, of course, they made the embarrassing discovery that there was insurrection happening on both sides of this great defensive line, so it couldn't be achieving quite all that they'd hoped for it. They also emphasized, in French colonial fashion, the importance of outposts, which we've also seen a good deal of in Afghanistan, of course. Having strong military outposts which would hopefully divert enemy forces, but the outposts became themselves an enormous problem to keep them going, logistical among other things, and the policy ran into great difficulty. And there are beautiful accounts of it, among others in the work of a historian who I greatly respect, who, poor chap, ended up dying when he trod on a Viet Cong landmine in Vietnam. But Bernard Fall, French-born, wrote about the war in Indochina and saw the difficulty that France had made for itself in not thinking through early enough what it was actually trying to achieve. And he's an encouragement to all of you who may be doing research, as I know many of you are, because he did research in the form of going to Vietnam, to Tonkin, and asking people how the war was going, including the French top brass said excellently and produced lots of statistics, showed how well it was going. But he also went round the local mairie, the town offices in various town halls in various parts of Tonkin, and he asked to see the tax records. It's a very good methodology. And of course, he found that the payment of taxes had gone way down as the insurrection had gone up, to the point where it was evident there was no government control. And he talked with people, including Viet Minh, and he formed the impression that, contrary to what the French were saying, the war was not going very well. He still hoped for a French victory. He was quite a patriotic Frenchman, but he could see that it was not going well. And Bernard Fall was very aware of the limitations of applying doctrine in an abstract way. And if you look at his book about the US role in Vietnam, you will see there a skepticism about applying counterinsurgency doctrine blindly in Vietnam. He comments very interestingly about the British mission that was set up in Vietnam, which was supposed to implement counterinsurgency doctrine in Vietnam, and which failed to achieve anything. Why? Because essentially the Vietnam problem was completely different from that of Malaya. Completely. Whereas in Malaya, the cause had been that, essentially, of an ethnic minority with outside support, it is true, but without huge support within the society. In Vietnam, the causes of nationalism and communism had become inextricably linked long before the Americans got there. And that was the reason why, in Bernard Fall's view, counterinsurgency doctrine couldn't really apply in these very different, or at least that particular form of counterinsurgency doctrine couldn't really apply in Vietnam. The same attempts as had been made successfully in Malaya to create strategic villages in which people would be protected from the outside guerrilla forces simply didn't work in Vietnam. And that's because of the nationalism being so closely, communism and nationalism being so closely intertwined. Put people in strategic villages and hamlets, but some of them will be supporters of the communist cause. And actually, as we now know from subsequent memoirs, it's almost too good to be true. The official in charge of the Strategic Hamlets program for many years was actually a Viet Cong agent. So when wet liberals like myself wrote articles at the time, as we did, saying that the counterinsurgent, the Strategic Hamlet policy is counterproductive, and it probably will work to the advantage of the Viet Cong, little did we know how right we were. It was actually being implemented, astonishingly, by a Viet Cong agent. So, again, this is an injunction, I suppose, that all thinking about counterinsurgency has to be based on understanding the particular society and how it operates, what its worldview is, what its social structures are. In other words, counterinsurgency is like one of those wines that may be wonderful in the country of origin but doesn't travel very well. Just as insurgency doctrine, I mean, Mao's doctrine of insurgency, famously, he laid down certain criteria for it, including that it has to be in a country of vast expanse. That was one of his conditions for a successful insurgency. And there's a PS in Mao's collected works to the effect that an exception has to be allowed for Vietnam, which he would have regarded as a very small country indeed, where there seems to have been an insurgency despite its small size. And so now we come to the question about counterinsurgency doctrines in Afghanistan and can they work there? And I think the first thing is to say that one of the peculiarities of the situation, I'll get to more about Afghan society in a moment, but one of the peculiarities of the situation is the extent of reliance on air power, which is fairly unusual in counterinsurgency operations. It did, of course, happen famously and very extensively in Vietnam. And the reason for the extent of reliance on air power is to do with the very light Western presence. From the beginning, there's been an awareness that a heavy footprint in Vietnam, a heavy Western footprint in Vietnam would cause trouble. In fact, at the very beginning of the intervention, Paul Wolfowitz, in planning it, said we should win and then get out, because Afghans do not tolerate foreign presences for long. He was one of the senior Pentagon officials involved in planning the Afghan operation in 2001. He may also have had another motive for wanting to get out, because he was itching to get into Iraq. But that thought that Afghan society will not tolerate a very heavy and large Western presence is one that has influenced Western policy considerably up to now. So that's been one of the causes of reliance on a degree of air power, because if you have thinly spread forces over a large territory where the land communications are poor, inevitably you will rely on air power. Now, I should mention that the term light footprint was originally used in relation to Afghanistan by the Secretary General's Special Representative, Lakhdar Brahimi, an exceptionally able individual, an Algerian diplomat. And it was used in relation to the UN assistance mission for Afghanistan. That's what he said should have a light footprint. But the term got taken up and adapted and used in respect of the Western presence more generally as a sort of philosophy. And one of the problems, as it's turned out, with the notion of a light footprint is it does mean a heavy reliance on air power. And if, when soldiers are under attack, or for more general strategic purposes, air power is used, and if, as a result, there are mistakes, the effect on Afghan opinion risks being very serious. And I'll just mention one issue, one episode which I witnessed, which illustrates the complexity of this problem. I was at a conference in Germany at the headquarters of the Allied Rapid Reaction Corps, which is sort of NATO's fast action unit, 3 years ago, discussing the situation in Afghanistan, and with people involved in planning the war in Afghanistan there, and they were completely clear that their aim was zero civilian casualties. They knew what the dangers would be if there were repeated incidents of heavy civilian casualties. And this hasn't worked out. And last September we had the Human Rights Watch report on casualties of the air war in Afghanistan. Now, in numerical terms, they're not particularly high. I think the figures for 2008, first 8 months, if I remember rightly, were under 300. It may not seem a lot. But what is striking about them is, first of all, that many of them were clearly the result of appallingly bad intelligence. They were famously, as has often happened, attacks on wedding parties. And so to Afghans, they naturally look much more like callous murder than mere accident. And of course, it's entirely possible that the Taliban have deliberately, as it were, provoked situations which result in that kind of effect. I don't rule that out at all. It would be on a par with some other things they have done. But the effect has been extremely serious, not least because it has political reverberations in Afghanistan. One of the oddities of the resulting from the constitutional developments in Afghanistan since 2001 is the large role of Pashtun people who constitute very roughly, 40% of the population of Afghanistan. But they have strong representation in the parliament, in the assembly in Kabul, and are extremely vociferous about such bombing incidents. So they've had political repercussions, so much so that actually President Karzai, after one of these incidents, begged the Americans to stop bombing altogether, and even begged them to stop arresting Taliban altogether, which suggests there's a serious disjunction in the whole operation in Afghanistan. Now, that's enough for the moment about air power. A word also about the role of NATO, which is a special feature of the war in Afghanistan. And I can best sum up what I have to say by describing a talk I went to on dealing with internecine conflicts in Afghanistan by a senior British general who was describing the campaign, the principles on which it was based, and its effects. And about halfway through his talk, I began to think that when he was talking of internecine conflicts in Afghanistan, the internecine conflicts he was talking about were mainly within NATO. So such different perspectives have different NATO countries brought to what they're doing in Afghanistan. Basically, there are two, I suppose, core perspectives, but then there are variations on each. One perspective, which is largely the British, the American, and the Canadian one, but others share it, is that it's a stabilization mission which encompasses counterinsurgency, doctrine, and practice as an important part of that stabilization. And then a second view, of which I suppose Germany is the clearest advocate, is one that sees it as essentially a peacekeeping and peace-building operation, which indeed is what many had originally hoped the operations in Afghanistan would be. Our own British Defence Minister, famously, John Reid, 2 Defence Ministers ago now, but famously said that he thought it entirely possible that not a single British soldier would die in Afghanistan when they were deployed in ISAF. An astoundingly stupid record for a Brit to make, a stupid remark for a Brit to make, especially bearing in mind the history of Britain in Afghanistan. Now, the high level of involvement of NATO in Afghanistan has been coupled with an extreme nervousness in public opinion in NATO countries. And this has had a curious result. That in most NATO countries, there's been a reluctance of ministers to make the kind of statements of commitment, support, as well, here we stand, we think this is a cause worth fighting for, that you would normally expect in a cause where people are being asked to serve and possibly to die. Ministers have been reluctant to do this, and I suspect that among the many reasons for reluctance is not just public scepticism, but a curious correspondence or lack of correspondence between Afghanistan and Iraq, every argument you could make, and you could make very good arguments for the involvement in Afghanistan, it had a lawful basis in that the UN Security Council implicitly supported the original US role in Afghanistan in 2001, and certainly explicitly supported the role of the ISAF forces, the International Security Assistance Forces in Afghanistan, since then. So it's got a pretty cast-iron basis in, as it were, international law and organizational terms. That's impressive. It's also got an extraordinarily strong basis of justification in the number of refugees that have returned to Afghanistan. The largest single return of refugees in the past 30 years has been the return of refugees to Afghanistan. 5 million have gone back. And 5 million people voting with their feet is a pretty impressive record. Now, there are special factors that need to be noted that make that 5 million figure slightly less impressive than one might initially think. Some refugee camps, including some in Pakistan, were simply closed, putting pressure on refugees to return. It's one factor. Another factor is that some refugees who have returned either to their homes but to unemployment, or they've returned to camps inside Afghanistan that are almost as difficult and almost as remote from their own homes as where they were outside Afghanistan. Some have again become refugees. So it's not a perfect picture by any manner of means. But nonetheless, and in fact it's true of every single year since 2002, that it's the largest single refugee return in the entire world has been to Afghanistan. So there are things, impressive things that could be said in favour. One could add to the list. But the curiosity is that everything you could say in favour of Afghanistan was an implicit reproach to Iraq. There, the refugee flow had been outwards since the liberation by America. There, the legal basis was weak. So that may have been another factor inhibiting people from making over-strong or even justifiably strong claims in favour of the... Now, a word about the doctrine itself. The US began its operations in Afghanistan, as in Iraq, without a counterinsurgency doctrine, and that matter caused some anger in the US armed forces, including by those officers who did know something about counterinsurgency and were shocked at the lack of clear doctrine. And it was only when finally a doctrine was written in the US Army Field Manual 324, published in 2006, that there was anything clear you could point to that said this is what we should be doing, these are the principles on which we should be working. And it's an interesting document, this counterinsurgency manual. It's the only US Army publication ever to have received a book review in the New York Times. It's had, I forget how many millions of hits it's had on the Army website, from which it can be downloaded. It's even been published by an academic publisher with an additional forward, in fact 2 additional forwards, both of whom, I have to say, are by students who I have taught. So, and who are now, or later became senior US defense officials. So it's a remarkable achievement of the 2 authors of this document to have produced a bestseller, and one that did bring about a change in US policy. And the particular features of the manual that caused attention are its emphasis upon really providing reasons why citizens should support the state rather than go with the insurgents, provide reasons why they should not dislike the outside force. The importance of the conduct of outside forces was seen as critically important. Legal framework was emphasized, and particularly there was a need for more political military liaison than there had been. And General Petraeus then found himself implementing some of these ideas in Iraq. And the interesting thing about his implementation of them in Iraq is he didn't follow his own manual exactly. He did things somewhat differently, especially in Anbar province, the awakening councils. They're not out of any counterinsurgency manual. They're something that he did because it seemed necessary and right in the circumstances, and it was extremely effective. Now, the problem in applying these ideas in Afghanistan, and General Petraeus is now charged with that, in his role as head of Central Command. The problem with applying these ideas is, if I can summarize it in a nutshell, we can get back to it more in discussion. This theory of counterinsurgency, like all theories of counterinsurgency that I've read, posits a choice for individuals. Either people support the insurgents, or they support the state. That's essentially they're the two poles around which people gravitate. And in Afghanistan, there is simply no tradition of thinking about the state as the entity to which individuals are loyal. Their loyalties are local. And they're nonetheless strong for being local, but they are not to do with the state. And the history of Afghanistan is not a history of an effective unitary state. Even in the years, the first half of the 20th century, when it was notionally a state, there were coups, and there was also, under the carapace, if you like, the overall umbrella of the monarchy, there was an enormous amount of autonomy given to the type of people we would now call warlords. And what the West is trying to do in Afghanistan, for entirely understandable reasons, is to create something like a Western state. And much that is important, including education, depends upon the idea that this is a state project. And I'm afraid I'm a complete pessimist about that. If you look at two critical areas and ask yourself, is there really an Afghan state? Taxation is the first area. Afghanistan has absolutely one of the lowest rates of taxation, at least lowest amounts of taxation as a proportion of the national budget of any state in the world. It doesn't collect taxes. So it doesn't enter into people's lives in that rather unpleasant but necessary way that we all have to get accustomed to. And nor does it provide the kind of services that many states provide. So it just doesn't feature large in people's lives. And this leads me to another comment on counterinsurgency doctrine, which I think is going to be put right, but belatedly, in the revised version of the US manual. I've spoken with the authors of it. And that's what it says about justice in the judiciary. It's often emphasized as a sort of PS in counterinsurgency writing. It's important to have a effective judicial system. And in much Western rhetoric about Afghanistan, there's emphasis on assisting the building up of a justice system. In fact, Italy was charged with this, not necessarily the most suitable country to be instituting it, but there we go. Then the reality of Western attempts at building up justice in Afghanistan is, I'm afraid, rather limited. I've spoken with people who've worked with provincial reconstruction teams in each of Afghanistan's provinces about their attempts to build up justice systems. And they have said that they're a complete failure. They just do not work. And one described to me the justice system in Helmand province, the Western-style justice system of the central government, where any case takes literally years to be heard and is decided by corruption. It's who can bribe the judge the most. And he said the Taliban system of justice in the same province is actually quite open and transparent. People know who the judges are, and it's relatively quick and efficient. And it's not the case that everybody is happy with their verdicts. The Taliban are not particularly popular in Afghanistan. But it is the case that that's a system that has a functioning that the Western system of justice does not. And I think any notion of counterinsurgency that doesn't take account of justice issues and how justice is dispensed is a notion that isn't going to be very successful. Now, I've spoken for long enough, and it's plenty of time for discussion, but perhaps I'll be allowed to conclude by quoting a War Office manual of 1899, which was written by an officer who had been involved in the wars in Afghanistan and had seen how difficult they are. And in this War Office manual of 1899, he said, "With the capture of the capital, any approach to organised resistance under the direct control of the head of state will almost always cease, but that does not mean the conflict is at an end. The British experience in Afghanistan shows that these irregular, protracted, indefinite operations offer far greater difficulties to the regular armies than the attainment of the original military objective." Amen to that. Thank you.
Thank you. We do have some time, about 45 minutes, to entertain questions and comments that you might have. There are also microphones which will be passed around. Could you please introduce yourselves? And there's a question over here.
Yes.
There's a microphone if you don't mind. Yeah.
Hi. My name is Victor Ramraj. I'm from the law school at NUS. I just wanted to pick up on your last point about justice. And it occurs to me that there may be two kinds of justice that we would need to be concerned about. One is delivering justice in terms of private disputes at a very sort of local, individual level. And I suspect that not knowing a whole lot about counterinsurgency doctrine, that one of the things that you'd want to do is to look to the institutions that are already respected and to build up their capacity to deal with those disputes. But I think there's a different kind of justice, which is constitutional justice, which is the way in which the state restrains itself, which also contributes to a sense of to a sense of loyalty to the state as opposed to the insurgents. So I just wanted to see if what your reactions were to that.
Basically, I agree. I think they're extremely good points. On the first point, the difficulty with looking to institutions that are already respected is it's very, very difficult for Western democratic powers to have any dealings with, let us say, a Taliban system of justice that might deny women an education. It really is something that is a compromise too far. And yet, to set up a system of justice that is completely different and is based on a Western model that means nothing to the inhabitants of the country is also hugely problematical. So my inclination would always be to try to think, is there any way in which it is possible to build on, cooperate with some elements of the local system of justice where they are less awful than those which would deny rights of women. And I take that just as one example of many types of example. And I think there are, in particular places, particular areas, but I would lack the confidence to say countrywide that can be done. And of course, any effective system of justice that defended the rights of all citizens might well become under threats from the Taliban. And so it's a very difficult path to pursue, but I sympathise with it. On your point about the central government, I'm not certain that constitutional restraint would achieve all that much in the particular circumstances of Afghanistan. It's certainly true that bribery has reached notorious proportions, and people close to Karzai have been minting money in from the drugs trade, among other things. But whether you can actually create a better system which will impress your ordinary, if there is such a thing, Afghan citizen, I'm less certain, because our Western ideas just don't go down very well there. I mean, an interesting example is when they had the Loya Jirga, which was a good idea, at the end of 2001, when the Taliban regime had fallen. They had the Loya Jirga to try and create a new constitutional order. One of the tragicomedies of that Loya Jirga was that a majority of representatives present wanted to reinstate the monarchy in Afghanistan. Now, needless to say, the United States did not think it had just fought a great war for freedom in order to have a reactionary monarchy restored to Afghanistan. And CIA men went round the Loya Jirga with large sums of money, dollar bills, to persuade people that calling for the restoration of the monarchy was not a good idea. But it just illustrates that there's potentially big cultural clashes in what we think an appropriate form of government in Afghan eyes would be.
Hello, my name is Chen Haitao, coming from China. I'm currently MPP junior student at LKYS School of Public Policy. And to be frank, I'm currently doing an assignment on political analysis on ethnic conflict in Sri Lanka. So since you are now talking about counterinsurgency theory, I wonder if you have any comments on the historical origin or the current situation on the Sri Lanka situation, and do you have any personal viewpoints for how the state can restructure its capacity building and its institution, transformation, so as to solve the issue fundamentally? Thank you.
I do indeed have rather strong views about Sri Lanka, and let me confess where they're coming from. I knew very well and had known for 40 years the foreign minister of Sri Lanka, Lakshman Karigama, who was a Tamil, who was assassinated by the Tamil Tigers in 2005, in August 2005, in his home in Colombo. My sympathies are not wholly, therefore, with the Tamil Tigers. And I think they have been, in many ways, a peculiarly brutal movement. But they're the ones who introduced suicide bombing as you know, long before Islamic militants took up suicide bombing, that it was happening in Sri Lanka. And they have waged a war which has at times been extraordinarily callous of the interests of ordinary citizens. 3 years ago, for example, they cut off the sluice gates which irrigated the fields of literally thousands of farmers and forced them to become refugees. So their methods of war I find pretty appalling. As regards what I think about the counterinsurgency operations, if you call them that, in Sri Lanka, first of all, I think that they have lacked a clear overall vision and purpose. The successive Sri Lankan governments have been remarkably bad at putting up a persuasive and attractive vision of a degree of Tamil autonomy within the Sri Lankan state. And indeed, as you know better than I, part of the origin of the insurgency, the Tamil insurgency, lies in the extent to which the nation-building process in Sri Lanka was associated with what they call Sinhalization. But it seemed to leave, to the Tamils, it seemed to leave them in the cold, and they feared for the future of their language and so on and so forth. There were issues to address, and I think successive Sri Lankan governments have not been very good at putting up an attractive, persuasive vision of what the future might look like, and we now await that now that they have defeated the Tigers. Much of their war has not exactly been counterinsurgency, because the Tamils have been a conventional force in the last few years at least. They've had an army, a navy, and an air force. Not a very impressive air force. And indeed, the attempts to develop a navy, I think they even had submarines, but the attempts to develop a navy aroused particular anger in the Sri Lankan government because they were asked by the Norwegian mediators to negotiate a deal, which was a disarmament deal or an arms control deal, whereby the Sri Lankan Navy would be accepted as controlling certain parts of the sea, and the Tamil Tigers Navy would be accepted as controlling other parts. And not surprisingly, a sovereign government finds that a particularly difficult pill to swallow, and they were not willing to swallow it. And I think the story of Sri Lanka is not so much a story of counterinsurgency, although there's elements of that, as really a straight military, almost conventional military struggle, now coming near to the end. And my guess is that there is not likely to be a long insurgency after the end of this war, because I think the manner of the rule of the Tamil Tigers was such that there will not be huge determination and loyalty to carry on with supporting that system of rule. That's my guess.
Thank you. Jim Tejan, Professor, would you share with us the highlights of the counterinsurgency doctrine that has seemed to have worked in Iraq, and was the surge a part of that?
Yes.
And how will the doctrine in the renewed efforts in Afghanistan have to be different?
The answer that many people would give to that, but it's not my answer, would be that the decisive thing was the Anbar Awakening Councils was taking advantage of the fact that Iraqis had gradually tumbled or gradually reached the conclusion that Al-Qaeda's motives for being in Iraq were not wholly benevolent. Not a very difficult conclusion to reach, I would have thought. But it had taken time, but there had been that realization. And Al-Qaeda, as terrorist movements often do, This is one of the reasons why the Philippines movement collapsed, the Hook Rebellion collapsed. They, if I remember rightly, I think it was the widow of Ramon Magsaysay they killed. But anyway, they went too far in their assassinations and aroused great popular hostility. And the same went for Al-Qaeda's extremism in Iraq. And Petraeus had the wit to see that. Now, it would be great to say, so it's nothing to do with counterinsurgency doctrine, and certainly nothing to do with the surge. It's just to do with an intelligent general, and I hasten to add, one with a doctorate in international relations, advertising for taking our subject seriously, who achieved these things. Fine. But actually, I'm inclined to think, from what I've read about this and the reasons why the surge actually worked, why the awakening councils worked, that the surge was important. For two reasons. One, at a time of extreme difficulty, when a dubious enterprise, I was always against the Iraq war. In fact, the last time I was in Singapore was to preach to an American military conference and say, well, I thought the Iraq war was a mistake. I thought I was going to get assassinated, but luckily there was a representative of the Bush administration there, and the officers were so furious with that person that I escaped. That's another story. But the truth is that the surge had an effect in conveying resolve and determination, and it also had an effect because you do need numbers if you're going to protect people and be seen to protect people. And counterinsurgency is very labour-intensive indeed, and involves training local forces. And again, that there should be an effective training program was part of the surge as well that was used for that purpose. So I'm inclined to go with what I take to be the thrust of your question, that the surge was not unimportant in this process of change.
Afghanistan.
Oh, in Afghanistan, yes. We don't yet know the outcome of the various inquiries that have been set in train in relation to Afghanistan. There are several. General Petraeus is doing one. Richard Holbrooke is doing one. There's a British inquiry being done by our former ambassador to Afghanistan, Gerard Cooper-Coles, looking both at Pakistan and at Afghanistan, as is Richard Holbrooke. So we've got all these inquiries, and to my mind, the critical question is not numbers of troops. The critical question is, what exactly is it that is being attempted to do there? And will it be possible to operate with local forces? I mean, there's no doubt that there's everything I've said, which might seem highly critical of the US involvement in Afghanistan, or aspects of it, is also something that the current US administration is aware of, very aware of. I mean, here's a statement Joe Biden made, if I've got it right, yes. He made last month, 6th of February, so less than 4 weeks ago. He said, the United States has geography, demography, and history working against us. The economic and social conditions in Afghanistan are daunting. We have a long way to go there. There's no solution in Afghanistan without Pakistan. We've got to make Afghanistan the world's responsibility, not just that of the United States. Well, my God, that's going to be an uphill task. Because if you both say that the situation there is extremely difficult, which is what he's honestly recognizing, and then you say, please chip in, it's going to be very difficult to get people to chip in. Now, there have been signs that the United States recognizes that there must be a fundamental shift in Afghanistan from the philosophy of, as it were, nation building to the philosophy of respect for local councils, local elders, local ways of doing things. And there's got to be a change from the philosophy of killing Taliban to the philosophy of protection. And to give you one example, and this is from, I heard this last week from an officer who's been serving in Afghanistan, an American. He said that basically what they've been doing is what they call lawn mowing, which is you go into an area, you kill any Taliban you can find, and then you leave and go to another area to mow the lawns there. And he said, the trouble with that is the next time you go back to the same village you were in originally, you find that the people who helped you aren't there anymore. I mean, it's that bad. That's what has been going on. Not because of a complete absence of awareness of the costs of doing what they're doing, but because of a lack of real clarity of purpose. And it takes a lot of clarity of purpose to decide to do things on a more modest basis, but to offer real protection and not just going in and then going out again. And it's that kind of issue that, to my mind, is absolutely critical. I'm not one of those, incidentally, you might have thought it from what I said, but I'm not one of those who thinks that the story of Afghanistan is simply a story of rejection of foreign powers. There is an impressive story of rejection of foreign powers, that's beyond doubt. But it's also true that in Afghanistan's long-running civil wars, which have now been continuous since the beginning of the 80s, in fact since the mid-70s, in those long-running civil wars, all factions seek outside patrons. They need them for one reason or another: money, weapons, personnel, volunteers, propaganda, whatever. They need outside patrons. So the idea that Afghans simply reject all outside help is mistaken. And a lot of opinion polls in Afghanistan still show a degree of support for outside forces. But I think it's teetering on the edge, and particularly teetering on the edge in southern and eastern Afghanistan. What I would say about the surge is it all depends on whether there can be clarity of purpose and whether there can be agreement. For example, with some of the countries that might provide troops. There's a big debate going on in Australia at the moment about whether they should provide forces for Afghanistan. Very difficult issue, very difficult. And I think, to my mind, the first thing that has to come is clarity of purpose, and that's why all these inquiries that are going on at the moment. And they're all headed by exceptionally able people, I have to say. I mean, if you wanted to get three sets of brains going that would have a strong ability to analyse and an independence of mind, capacity to think originally, General Petraeus, Richard Holbrooke and Sherard Cooper-Coles wouldn't be a bad choice. So it'll be very interesting to see what comes out of their various inquiries. Whether they will agree with each other is to be doubted, because Sherard Cooper-Coles, for example, the British representative, is rather allergic to counterinsurgency thinking in the first place, which maybe the others aren't, I don't know. Well, certainly Petraeus isn't. But there could be creativity in that disagreement. But I think that's the first thing. I think a surge for surge's sake would not achieve much. It might have negative effects. But it's the purpose, the tactics, what goes with it. Is there a consistent and serious attempt to do something about the appalling system of justice in Afghanistan, for example? All of that, to my mind, provides the basis of a possible answer.
Hello, my name is Michael Ruska. I'm a PhD student here at the Lee Kuan Yew School. I would like to link to the previous questions and to your comments. Ultimately, from the historical experience, do you think that all the efforts that we are doing right now in Afghanistan, ultimately, are we destined to fail? Are we destined to failure again? Notwithstanding all the efforts that go into it. And here I would refer, for example, to Martin van Creveld at Hebrew University, who basically argues if a strong, in asymmetric conflict or in a nonlinear warfare, that if a strong army fights the weak, essentially the strong becomes weak, and the weak defends the strong, defeats the strong. That's one point that I want to make if you look down to the future. And the second point, regarding the clarity, the question of clarity that you just mentioned, there are basically two ways. Either way, one is that the US or the NATO can look at the capacity to carry out the intentions of the insurgents, or focus on the intentions themselves. So if you were to prioritize, which direction to go, because, it is very difficult to change the intentions of these insurgents. So is it maybe more easier to focus on the capacity to carry out those intentions? So both of them are very, very, big questions, But ultimately, are we really destined to fail there? And whether we should focus on the capacity or of the insurgents or the intentions. Thank you.
I'm nervous about generalizations in my field, the field of international relations. Grand generalizations have a way of coming unstuck in the face of awkward realities. And I have a particular dislike of grand strategic generalization. Now, Martin van Creveld's remark, whenever a large army comes in contact with a weak insurgency, the weak insurgency tends to grind it down. It's just not true. I mean, sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. Cases where insurgencies have in the end been defeated by long, patient army work include not only the Milan case I mentioned and the Filipino case I mentioned, but a number in the Western Hemisphere. Think of the way in which Che Guevara, that wonderful, romantic, and in my view, dangerous figure, led his forces to defeat in Bolivia because they had no real purchase on Bolivian society. So, in our own case, of course, I'm bound to be influenced by it. Northern Ireland, where we went through 25 or 30 years of fairly low-level insurgency and attacks on the mainland UK. But we endured it, and the insurgency worked itself out. And in my view, insurgencies often do die out, not because they're defeated, and this gets a bit more towards your second question, but because they're not achieving anything. And sometimes they die out with a decision of the insurgents that the thing isn't working. For example, the Milan Communist Party actually made a decision in 1951, I think it was, but to stop terrorist attacks in towns in Malaya because they were having negative effects. And that's quite often the way things work out in these campaigns, that they may grind down. It may take a generation for it to happen, as it did in Northern Ireland, but eventually they give up. So I don't buy the Martin van Creveld argument. As regards whether in Afghanistan you should aim to be cutting the ability, reducing the ability of Taliban, or changing their intentions, or what, there is a basic difficulty in dealing with an insurgency which has such access across borders as the Taliban have in Afghanistan. And that's led, of course, to the American pressure to to extend the use of air power and indeed some army raids into the territory of Pakistan. It's worth remembering that when it was engaged in its counterinsurgency campaign in Afghanistan, the Soviet Union organised literally thousands of raids into Pakistan. It's been forgotten in much of our debate that they also, incidentally, put a huge effort into education and, as it were, civic development of various kinds. That's also often forgotten. And that makes me nervous about ideas of counterinsurgency that think if you build a dam or a school or provide electricity, somehow the natives will be grateful. It doesn't work like that. And the achievement of some kind of order depends upon working with local forces, working with the grain of local forces rather than against the grain of local forces. And that, as I say, may mean making some pretty serious and unpleasant compromises with people you'd rather not work with. But we're stuck with doing that to an extent anyway. We're working with some pretty appalling warlords in Afghanistan as it is. And the question is really whether in some provinces we ought to be trying to work with Taliban. And in fact, contacts are now happening. It isn't a heretical idea. There are now contacts and attempts being made to do that. But my worry is that things are getting past the point of no return. I mean, many of you will have read, no doubt, of the decision that was reported at the beginning of this week that 3 different Taliban factions in Waziristan in Pakistan have united in order to stop the struggle in Pakistan, being against the Pakistan government, but in order to focus it against the foreign presence in Afghanistan. And that kind of development makes the kind of path I'm suggesting much more difficult to follow.
We have about 10 minutes and about 3 questions. Would you mind if we listen to them all at one go? Yes.
I'm Hina Khalid, and I'm from Pakistan. I'm an MPP junior here at the LKY School of Public Policy. So my question is with reference to Pakistan, and can you please comment a bit on the viability of the counterinsurgency doctrine which was used by Pakistan in combating insurgencies in the FATA region? And one of the main arguments which is being put forward these days is that the military was by and large unsuccessful because they did not take the cultural aspect into consideration while they were implementing the use of force in those areas. And my second question very quickly is also that the counterinsurgency doctrine as it stands today, do we see it in future accommodating cultural aspects into it, or will it by and large stay the way it is today? Thank you.
Sir?
I'm Jordan Exani. I'm a researcher at the Royal Military College of Canada. My question is, I was wondering if you could elaborate on perhaps the relationship between developing a counterinsurgency strategy combined with political end dates of missions. As you'll know, in Canada, we just rewrote our strategy for Afghanistan in May of 2008 and set a deadline to be out of Afghanistan by July 2011. And it seems as though there's a profound impact on the doctrine in regard to that political imperative.
My question and comment is on the cross-border sanctuary, something you mentioned. And it is this, whatever the clarity of mission within Afghanistan, even if that can be much improved, and incidentally, if you focus more on protection of the population, I guess you need many more troops, boots on the ground. But even if you have all that, can the insurgency be defeated or eventually whittled away so long as there's a clear sanctuary across the border? And what can be done to eliminate or weaken that sanctuary, say with the cooperation of Pakistan or otherwise?
all extremely good questions. On the Pakistan counterinsurgency efforts, I think it's fair to say that for understandable reasons, the Pakistan army has never had a serious counterinsurgency doctrine, or maybe never had a counterinsurgency doctrine at all. The understandable reasons being that the Pakistan army has been overwhelmingly, throughout its history, concerned with the threat, as it perceives it, from India, and concerned with, as it were, planning, preparing for operations against Indian forces. And anything to do with the Fatah or other areas not under direct government control was a sort of add-on extra, but was not part of the central mission. That's been one problem. Another problem is that in the frontier forces, I forget their name, but you'll be able to tell me, there's a very high local recruitment element, and their reliability has always been in question, local Pashtun recruitment. What is it called, the Pakistan Frontier Force? Yeah. And that's posed a problem. Basically, what has happened is on a number of occasions, sometimes due to American prodding, there have been magnificent kinetic army incursions into the Fatah areas in order to demonstrate an attempt at government control and to show the outside world that Pakistan is making its writ run. But these have not been based on any known counterinsurgency doctrine. And only now is it beginning to be recognized that a different approach is needed. There was a very interesting debate in the Pakistan Parliament shortly after the last elections. I think it was in September, if I remember rightly, of last year, when they discussed, among other things, the problem posed by terrorism in Pakistan and the problem of what to do about the Fatah. And the Parliament really recommended a different approach, including one that I would recognise as being more counterinsurgency oriented, plus a much more systematic attempt to negotiate with such authorities as there may be in the area. And, of course, that does imply acceptance that the writ of the state will be limited in those areas. But what's striking so far is the absence of serious doctrine. And on the second point, I think the answer is very simple. If counterinsurgency doctrine is to be any good, it must take into account cultural factors. And it's a big question whether it has. I mean, the great criticism one can make historically of much counterinsurgency doctrine is cultural insensitivity and a lack of, as it were, political savvy. There was one famous French counterinsurgency theorist who wrote the wonderful sentence, which might have been taken out of the Bible. He said, "In the beginning there is nothing." And what he meant was that you have a wholly, as it were, innocent society, which is peaceful, and then an outside force in the form of a terrorist, probably a communist terrorist, comes in and disrupts this beautiful society, and that's the origins of insurgency. Well, if you explain insurgency in those simple terms, you're not going to understand it, because insurgency always has local roots. And that doesn't mean it's justified, but it does mean you've got to understand the thought processes that lead people to take part in insurgencies. And those thought processes clearly, in the case of the North African insurrection, the Algerian insurrection, which is what the French were writing about at that time, it clearly included a sense of national insult at the external domination of their societies. So those things always have to be taken into account, and it's just as counterinsurgency doctrines need to encompass thinking about law and law enforcement and how that is to operate. So equally, they need to be aware of cultural factors. And I think, to be fair, that's implicit in much of the writing of General Petraeus and others. On the question of political end dates that you asked, I think rigid thinking about end dates is itself a problem. If you do what Canada has done and announce the date by which your forces will be gone from Afghanistan, then the Taliban will know that unless somebody else comes and takes Canada's place, which is always possible, they've only got to hang on till that date. And then they can make hay while the sun shines. So fixed dates seem to me to be a problem. At the same time, it is, as I said, necessary to indicate a willingness to retreat, because if an operation is perceived as an imperialistic measure to take permanent control in a territory, it's likely, I wouldn't say this happens in every society, but it's likely in many societies that will be perceived in a very negative way. I think that effect is likely in Afghanistan. And it's not to be excluded. It's not an unreasonable view of this huge, great US encampment at Bagram in Afghanistan, that this is establishing an American presence in Central Asia more generally. That's another consequence of the Afghan war for international security. For the first time, the United States has a major presence in Central Asia. So it's and the effect of that on people in Afghanistan is likely to, in my view, is likely to be one of making them more critical of the American role rather than less. The trick is to indicate a willingness to depart, but without setting a rigid end date, and to be convincing in conveying that message, and that is very, very difficult indeed. On the point about cross-border sanctuaries, I completely agree, and one of the reasons why the counterinsurgency could be as effective as it was in Malaya was that the cross-border sanctuaries had a very minor role in Malaya. There was some support from outside for the Malayan insurgency. Indeed, there was a radio station set up in the People's Republic of China, while purporting, of course, to be in Malaya, to be representing the heroic people of Malaya rebelling against the infamous colonial ruler, which was in fact broadcasting from China. So they had outside help. But I agree that such outside help becomes much more serious when it's the form of sanctuary. And the question is what to do about it. And in most cases, I would argue that attacking the sanctuary in order to stop support coming from it is a disaster. Think of the limited effects and ghastly consequences of the US bombing of Cambodia in the course of the Vietnam War, and what that ultimately led to in Cambodia. Or think of the Soviet attempts to stop cross-border support from Pakistan and where that all failed. So, and I mean, going back a bit, the First World War started with an attempt to stop support for terrorism it was an attack on the hornet's nest of Serbia by the Habsburg monarchy that gave us the First World War. So there isn't a wonderful record for military attacks on such sanctuaries, and yet they are an extremely serious problem. And the ideal way of coping with them is what we were able to do, owing to lucky circumstances, in Northern Ireland, which is to collaborate with the government on the other side of the border and try and get a joint approach. And that, no doubt, is what the United States is desperately trying to do at the moment in relation to Pakistan, to get a joint effective approach in dealing with this problem. It's actually extremely hard to see what that approach would be in this case. And that's what makes me, in answer to the last part of your question, impossible to be optimistic about Afghanistan. But that doesn't mean to say I think that it's time simply to pick up, as it were, the tents and go. But I do think that the sanctuary problem makes it very, very difficult. And many of the Taliban, as it were, foot soldiers are undoubtedly young people, ill-educated, torn out of madrasas, including in Pakistan, and shoved into the front line. And that's a long-term and difficult problem to solve.
On that note, I think that's about all the time that we have. Will you please join me in thanking Adam Roberts for what has been, I think, an interesting and important discussion.